Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today during our series of lectures and discussions about the paranormal in American art and culture. My name is Angela Olson. I am the Studio Programs Associate at MIA, and a big portion of my job is to help support programming in relationship to special exhibitions, and it has been my great honor to be able to work alongside Bob Casalino and Heather Everhart on this amazing exhibition of Supernatural America. So we are here today in Badeo Ta'atunwe, Minnesota Makoche, also known as Minneapolis, Minnesota. That is where the Minneapolis Institute of Art is located, which is the stolen ancestral and contemporary homelands of the Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Ho-Chunk nations. Just a few housekeeping things for you to let you know what's going on. Myself and Heather Everhart will be monitoring the chat, and we'll kind of be harvesting questions that you have. There's also the Q&A function that you can use to submit questions that you have. You can also private message myself or Heather if you have things that come up for you. We'll kind of be keeping an eye on things. And then if there's time at the end of everyone's talk, they'll be able to answer some of those questions. We have a lot of exciting programming going on through the run of this show. Supernatural America is at Minneapolis until May 15th. And we've got talks, we've got performances, we've got more virtual programming. So keep an eye on artsmia.org for all of those kind of offerings. So we are here today to celebrate Supernatural America, which is an exhibition that explores the numerous ways that artists in the United States have made sense of their own experiences of the paranormal and the supernatural, developing a rich visual culture of the intangible. So today I am going to introduce to you the curator of this exhibition, Robert Casalino, and he will give you a little bit more information on the rest of the panelists and speakers today. So Robert Casalino is the Patrick and Amy Butler Curator of Paintings at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. He curates collaboratively in partnership with artists, colleagues, and broad communities. And I mentioned this yesterday at our live event, but I can speak from experience to tell you that that is very true. Starting where you are is critical to Bob's practice, knowing the immediate context and deeper history of the place in which he works. It also means working with humility and accepting that there is much yet to learn from others. That is why curating in relation is so powerful. Dr. Casalino is drawn to artists that make work about the full range of human experience, especially those who aspire to visually express the intangible, states of consciousness, and a full range of emotions. Although he has worked on topics from the 19th and 20th centuries, he regularly works with contemporary artists in examining history. Because he gravitates to artists and subjects that have been overlooked or deliberately marginalized in his field, some have called him the curator of the dispossessed, especially for championing underrepresented artists. So with that, I will turn it over to Bob and the rest of our panelists and speakers today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Angela. And I wanted to thank not only you, but Molly Lax, Heather Everhart, and Brian Teig, who are running the show and helping with all sorts of stuff behind the scenes. So thank you. Before we start, I do have some other housekeeping things to get out of the way. I wanted to mention that this and the other programs and the show itself would not be possible without funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Wyeth Foundation, which helped support the catalog, the Terra Foundation for American Art, Thomson Reuters, Art Bridges, and Chuck and Kathy Harper, who are generous supporters based in Chicago. As Angela said, I am the curator of the exhibition, but nobody gets here alone to this point. Had a lot of collaborators and advisors and helpers and supporters along the way. And for those of you who are coming to this program uninitiated and want to know a little bit more about the background for this exhibition and what we're about to talk about, I thought it would be useful just to run through some of the kinds of things that are in the show very quickly, just a teaser, not comprehensive at all, so that you have a little bit more grounding in the visual language of the broader show before you hear from the artists, and you get a sense of why it came together in the first place. So before that, I have to say that it is Ivan Albright's birthday. He did pass into spirit in 1983, but I want to say that this show kind of came from him in the first place with me. So happy birthday to Ivan. Happy birthday to Ivan. Anyway, I thought it was auspicious that that's the case. So the show really takes as its central theme the idea of spirit contact and contact with the otherworldly through the lives and experiences of artists, takes them seriously, treats their experiences with dignity, and asks, what does that have to do with the creative process, with the objects they made, and the broader cultures and communities to which they are connected? So almost everything in the exhibition, and it includes about 180 objects, I would say about 90 to 95%, we know for a fact are by artists for whom this worldview of having spirit contact or contact with something outside of ourselves or this planet was something they took seriously, was integral to their lived experience, and they made art about it. So whether we're talking about people from the past, like Gertrude Abercrombie there on the upper left, or Einel Talpazan, they are integrated into the show for that particular reason. And it centers the experiences of artists by looking at their archives and the historical record, interviews, if they're no longer with us. In the case of the contemporary artists, and there are a few contemporary artists in this project, I was very conscious about talking to them, getting their point of view, getting their okay on the kinds of context that they would be put into, and also making sure that I heard from them about which objects would best represent them. So whether that's Betty Saar in LA or in our backyard, Choling Taha from Anoka, Minnesota, that's always been critical to my practice. Outreach to the spiritualist community was also something that took many years and was integral to presenting something new in this project in terms of grounding the experiences of mediums and channelers and spirit artists. So I'm very grateful to the spiritualist community across the country that helped me find the language and the right tone for presenting this work. And like I said, we're looking at ways that artists to visualize spirit contact, whether it's in this tiny ivory that's a miniature that's in the exhibition, only about an inch high, that shows the contact between a woman's daughter coming out of her grave to make contact at the gravesite to the mourning mother, or a full room-sized installation by somebody like Whitfield Lavelle, a contemporary artist who had never been really asked about whether he fit in this context, but was very happy to talk about it. And so we have that kind of jump from scale. And we have mourning narratives, explaining why would there be this need to make contact with those who've gone into the spirit world in times of national trauma after the American Civil War, or in other times specific to local communities. We're looking at how artists made art about that and recontextualizing in that way. And of course, one of the major grounding ideas in this exhibition is that America has come to be, we are here and are able to be here because of a violent national history that has reaped ghosts that continue to demand to be honored and to be reckoned with and to have us make amends to them. So John Hoteleanos's piece that turns the tables on manifest destiny ideas from an indigenous point of view was a grounding piece of work in that kind of context. We are looking at how some artists are making sculptures and thinking about that in an aesthetic practice, but these sculptures are also sites of sacred communion with the spirits. They're made to attract spirits. They're made to honor spirits. They have power in them. They're living things rather than simply inert objects. And so we examine that as well. And when we look at apparitions and the idea of specters and ghosts, we're looking more broadly than just an image of a ghost that you might expect to see in a Hollywood movie. But thinking about how artists like Ivan Albright are thinking about matter and spirit and the different ways that they're experiencing the visualizing of them, the seeing of them, the feeling of them in their bodies and in the bodies of their sitters, by not just showing flesh as a kind of shell, but showing the emanating spirit that is around it and coming out of it. It also looks at artists who are very well known, like James McNeill Whistler, and puts them in a new context that was very specific to how they thought about their work, with spirit artists who were working at the same time, like the Campbell brothers. And people like Howard Tina Pindell and Bud Hopkins, who, again, you might not expect to have anything in common, but were friends, were in exhibitions together and had many conversations about the paranormal, including UFO narratives. And so talking to those artists or looking at their archives, again, helps us to see how they connect to broader things than the way that they've been always contextualized. And again, it comes directly from those artists. And finally, one of the things that's very new about this project is looking at American spirit artists, those who were not first and foremost artists, but people who are working in a sacred ritual context in spiritualist camps, mediums first and foremost, who allowed their bodies to be controlled by spirits in order to make artwork, and sort of demystifies that. But by doing the demystification of explaining what happens in that, I hope that it actually expands how we see artistic practice, creativity, and the relationship between spirit and the unconscious. So that's the context that artists like Frances Haynes McVeigh, who you see here, is placed in this exhibition. So I hope those of you on this virtual program will be able to see the show in person. This is the final stop for it. If you're not able to come, there is a catalog. And the two artists who are on our program today did contribute to that catalog, Renee and Tony, and we'll talk to them later. But our first speaker today is Jeffrey Kripal. And Jeffrey is the J. Newton Razor Chair in Philosophy and Religious Thought at Rice University. He's the author of numerous influential books and essays, including Mutants and Mystics, science fiction, superhero comics, and the paranormal, authors of The Impossible, The Paranormal, and the Sacred, and many, many others that have influenced my way of thinking around this subject. He's also the founder of the Archives of the Impossible at Rice, which hosts a conference on March 3rd to 6th, featuring a wide range of speakers, including Jacques Bailly. So without further ado, here is Jeffrey Kripal.
Thank you, Bob. So I'm not an art historian and I don't have any pictures to look at. I do have some things to say, kind of set the context for what the paranormal has meant historically, and why it's so incredibly important to look at art through this lens. I am just so happy that this is being done. So let me read this paper. It's very short. It's about 20-25 minutes, and then we can move on. I want to begin actually with a quote from the book, from Robert himself. The quote reads, "We live in a nation in which forgetting the traumas that enabled its existence is a daily way of life, but one that is untenable. To remember is to confront ghosts, to ask what they want, to make amends, and to learn to live with them. Artists assert these ideas and often willingly court otherworldly contact as a way to move forward." It is no accident that Bob's big book begins with a racist vigilante group arresting a Black freedman, Henry Wells, in Carrollton, Alabama, accused of trying to burn down the local courthouse. Historians have no trouble delineating the vigilante mob, its racist legacy, or how they eventually murdered Henry 2 years later. Historians have much more trouble with the lightning bolt that etched Henry's face into the courthouse glass. I think I am supposed to say allegedly here. Dispersed the original racist mob and so temporarily saved Henry's life. And also, please note, created in the process a most unusual work of American art that persisted over the years, despite the white citizens changing the glass in an effort to remove the haunting image. Let me begin with the observation that although we are focused here on the history of American culture and art, American historians are hardly alone in the denials and hauntings of their histories and historiographies. The truth is that the history of any long or established human culture is spectral. And not just because seemingly every such culture is bigoted and potentially violent toward its own minority peoples and communities it fears, but, and this is my most pressing point, because this is what a human being appears to be, anywhere and at any time, an irreducible form of consciousness, temporarily enlivening a biological organism, a most mysterious being that is at once physical and spiritual, doubled, experientially too. The human being is in effect a living ghost, a conscious presence who will soon be without this body, that is, who will soon be dead, whatever that means. We assume we know what that word dead means. We do not. Let me say a few words now about the early anthropology of religion, which I think impacts profoundly on how we generally view art. Allow me to speak autobiographically for a moment. Is there any other way to speak? I was trained in the 1980s in a field called the history of religions at the University of Chicago. Our mentors very much meant the history part, although no one seems to believe we are historians. We learned languages, often rare or ancient ones. I studied Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, and Bengali. We worked in archives. We did ethnography, traveling around the globe to live in cultures in which we were not born. Our mentors also meant the religions part, quite seriously and in the plural. We were trained to look for those dimensions of human life that could not be slotted into the usual secular frameworks. We were taught to love social and historical reductions of all kinds. I was especially drawn to psychoanalytic methods, but always to question them. We were also taught to think philosophically, although no one seems to believe that we are actual philosophers. We read widely in philosophy, theology, history, literature, art, and the anthropology and sociology of religion. Among these multiple readings was the British founder of the cultural anthropology of religion, Sir Edward Burnett Tylor, whose theories of the origin of the soul in some form or another still dominate much of the academic discussion, including many of the art historical discussions. Tylor, of course, was not alone in his thoughts. The theory is typical of its time and place, which is to say that it is culturally arrogant, deeply misinformed, and racist to the core. Still, historians, anthropologists, and scholars of religion more or less assume some form of it today, usually in an updated, friendlier form. Certainly, most of the theories around the ghost or haunting as a form of collective traumatic memory is a version of this old idea, more sophisticated and less racist for sure, and used for all sorts of good and just reasons, but still the same old idea, wearing new clothes. My concern here is that intellectuals, even sympathetic ones, somehow think that they can continue working in what is basically a white rationalist materialist history or European secularism and not implicitly dismiss and demean most of the human experience. A history that screams, sometimes literally, against these same rationalist reductions. The old 19th century theory of the soul goes more or less like this. Souls don't exist, of course. The belief in such non-existent agencies goes back to ignorant, primitive people having dreams of family or community members who had just died. Since the loved one, somehow I never recall Tylor using that phrase, showed up in a dream, the pre-rational savage illogically assumed that this person must still have been living on in another world, in a spiritual world. Hence the mistaken belief in souls, hence all that nonsense about the afterlife, hence religious ideation and belief. It all stems from there, the theory goes, from the physical traumas of death and the subsequent conceptual and imagistic responses, including dream, that are meant to assuage this fear, answer this suffering, and deny this death. In short, such imagistic dreams and visions in the night are not only the origin of the soul, they are the origin of religion itself. Religion is internal dream imagery and art, narrative projected out into society. Religion is bad art. I guess I once assumed that too, without thinking too much about it, and certainly without any real research or talking to people who experienced otherwise. It sounded reasonable enough. It sounded plausible. There is actually a great deal of evidence that religion is a kind of practiced art, or art a kind of potential religion. But I no longer believe the soul theory. I think it's bunk, actually, ethnocentric bunk. Let me explain why. People continue to dream of loved ones who have died, and such dreams happen to all sorts of people, regardless of their race, gender, sexuality, religion, or nationality. And please note that these are not always illusory dreams. There is, in fact, something strangely, uncannily empirical about many of them. They give information that there is no other way the dreamer could have known. Specific times and places of the death, for example, and often coming to the dreamer or visionary before the death. Dead husbands show up, for example, in full physical form to sleeping wives, not to tell them ignorant make-believe about the afterlife, but to tell them to call the police and where exactly they will find the car and the body. Or mothers have dramatic, super specific videos go off in their head to warn them of what is about to happen to their children, not vaguely, but actually, in great detail down to the white smoke of the airbags that will be released into the crashed car. In actual historical truth, there is something about the human visionary capacity that does not give a whit about space or time, or the body for that matter. It just is not fully in any of these. There is another world or another dimension of this one, and we are in that one as well, right here, right now. If we take our historical sources seriously, I see no way around this double conclusion. I see endless ways to ignore the evidence, of course, or to wish it away with fancy jargon and present needs. But in the end, none of it really works. And our histories are less, not more, because of these false assumptions. This is not to say that such visions are always one-to-one descriptions. The two visionary accounts about which I hinted above, the widow and the mother, were in fact literal and descriptive. But many such reports are not. They are imagistic, symbolic, elusive, and elusive. They are narrative or mythical in structure and expression. Invisible entities take over the body and hands of the artists and perform the art. Art becomes a kind of channeling or possession and an affirmation. What Renee Stout calls the parallel universe becomes a place of sanity and resistance in what my colleague Tony Penn calls the absurdity of the racist white social world. Transcendence of this social world allows Stout to become what she calls, quote, a self-actualized woman thriving on the energy of her own agency and authority, creating her own sense of order and justice, and in so doing, helping others along, unquote. Similar things are true, of course, with American indigenous art, witnessing against the endless manifest destiny theologies and political exceptionalisms of the white Christian settlers, as John Joto Leaños has taught us in the volume, or of witch culture and the feminist art of the 1970s, vis-a-vis the dominant theistic and male-oriented mythologies, as Lacey Pripik-Hetke and Rachel Middleman have explored in their own respective contributions. George Hansen is correct. Magical phenomena deconstruct pretty much everything. Traditional religion, yes, but also, please note, rational science. To deconstruct is not only to deconstruct the unjust, it is also to deconstruct both belief and reason, including, by the way, most all of the critical theories academics use and too often consider sacrosanct. Sometimes, moreover, this elusive or symbolic communication from the other world is literally operationalized by a psychically gifted queer artist like Ingo Swann, and becomes the remote viewing practice of secret military and intelligence communities. A visionary practice that literally involves drawing, and please note, a broad spectrum of American religious communities, from Mormons and Methodists to Native Americans and Scientologists. which is all to say, America is supernatural and its art is paranormal, not because America is good or holy or because we are being superstitious, but because the American histories are defined by colonialism, racism, oppressive theologies, and yes, real psychical abilities, which do not belong to any particular social identity or body. Actual history is complicated, tortured, transformative, and at least potentially reflexive all at once. People who have undergone a profound paranormal experience will commonly say, "It was as if I was caught in a painting," or "It was as if I were in a movie." I would suggest they were, and that such a movie or painting almost always has, quote, "science fiction for a nervous system," unquote, to use the provocative phrase of the Mexican-American writer, John Philip Santos, himself a conscious and most eloquent genetic fusion of the Spanish colonizer and the indigenous colonized. This is why visionary art is so important to this humanist too. When those double parts of the human communicate with each other, they often communicate in image and story, which is to say, through art. They cannot communicate literally. As the common metaphor has it, when the fisherman wants to talk to the fish, he cannot use land language. He has to communicate in other ways. Symbol, image, and art are those ways in these visionary moments, and subsequently in the public expressions that the artists themselves create to communicate and express what they as fish were shown by the fishermen. Finally, allow me to utter a single plea. My plea is in fact already signaled by the fourth section of Bob's book on plural universes, much of which is on UFO or extraterrestrial art history. I understand, of course, that much of this remains historical in the traditional sense, but there is presently much theorizing that suspects something else may also be going on here. I want to make a most outrageous suggestion. I want to suggest that we may need to start beginning to think of history as moving not just from the past to the present, but also from the future to the present, which is its own past. That is, we may well need to begin thinking in circles. There is much in our humanistic canon to suggest as much. I might point to none other than Friedrich Nietzsche, his final teaching of the eternal recurrence of the same, or circular temporality, and his key notion of backward willing. For Nietzsche, the past can be influenced or willed. Physical events cannot be changed, but their meaning can be willed otherwise, and so redeemed, his language. I am also thinking of the recent work of the anthropologist Eric Wargo on precognition, dreams, the long self spread through the block universe of space-time, and the precognitive nature of literary and artistic creativity. For Eric, artistic creativity is a time loop, the future reaching back to the past. Or the time-traveling autobiographical work of John Philip Santos. John claims quite seriously that a voice of a future ancestor spoke to him through the radio signals of his own DNA and helped produce one of his two nonfiction memoirs. The Farthest Home is in an Empire of Fire. The ufological literature has long entertained such impossible thoughts as well. Hence my chapter on Jacques Vallée is entitled The Future Technology of Folklore. More recently, the physical anthropologist Michael Masters has pointed out that the visionary forms of the alien in many of the abduction accounts do in fact pretty much look like what a physical anthropologist would predict about the future human form. This is Nietzsche in another evolutionary form, from ape to human to superhumans. And on we could go into the past, yes, but also into or from the future. I guess what I finally want to say is this. If Bob is correct, and quote, artists assert these ideas and often willingly court otherworldly contact as a way to move forward, unquote, I think it is sometimes the case that this way forward is literally from the forward, that is, from the future. Artists are some of our best transponders of those distant signals along the space-time matrix. We would do well, very well, to see such artists and their visionary expressions and not reduce them to our measly secular categories and present materialistic worldviews, none of which will last. The American psychedelic and extraterrestrial bard Terence McKenna used to say out of his own visionary trips that we live in what he called a bad work of art. He meant it too, quite literally. The supernatural histories and paranormal art of the present volume attempt to recognize and work through that bad art to the extent that we can. But they also try to inspire us out of that past art and into another future vision of who we might yet become. May we become so. Okay, that's probably enough or too much. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Do we have any questions for Jeffrey after we've had a chance to digest all of that? And if not immediately, I just want to ask you a bit about the archives of the impossible and how you how you go about collecting and preserving narratives, or I'm not sure if they're objects or the kinds of things that would be, from my point of view, the kind of evidence of people having these experiences, which, like in the show, are a tangible manifestation of those experiences, and what the thinking around that is, and whether people can go visit them physically.
So the Archives of the Impossible consists of a couple 100,000 documents and objects that we've collected over the last 6 years through the Woodson Research Center at Rice University. So it's an actual archive, Bob. And yes, people can visit and study in it. That's the whole point of the archive, is to make these things public. My intention in helping, well, we haven't had any trouble having donors approach us, let me put it that way, because people want their life work preserved and they want it researched and talked about and thought about. So it began with Jacques Vallée, actually, and then Whitley Strieber and Ed May and Diana Pasulka and Alexander Stewart, a physical medium in England, and on and on and on it went. And my goal is to simply make these things serious objects of academic research and theory, and to just stop rolling our eyes and to take a serious look at this and to see this as part of the human condition, part of the human experience. And so that's really what it's all about. We've had an overwhelming response, by the way. We've had over 900 people register for the conference so far.
Right.
Mostly online, and we have about 175 people coming in person now, which is about all we can take. We had to cap it because we couldn't accept anymore. We don't have enough food or space.
Right. So another thing is that, in your writings, you're forthright about, and as you mentioned at the top, integrating your own personal experiences, your autobiography, in the way that you are weaving other folks' narratives that they've told to you or that you've read through the historical record, and theories about all of this material in religious studies. And, I think, you've mentioned that shift in religious studies to looking at this and taking it seriously and not trying to just sort of use it as a metaphor, but say that it's both. It's useful as both. It's real experience. And probably had to overcome all sorts of prejudices in the field about paying attention to this at all. That's certainly my experience in looking at this in the art world. Probably the easiest example to say is that in this show, we have artists who you've never heard of before, but also artists who have only ever been placed in a bin called outsider, which I don't use. And they're really being integrated into a broader context and shown with other artists who would never be called that, because there's this shared sensibility, but all this shared awareness of knowledge systems that are very real to these people. And I think if there's one of the aims of the show is to say, let's really look at that and let's take it seriously, and then see where taking it seriously allows us to go with other kinds of things. And so, I guess I would like to hear just a little bit about what that's been like for you as a scholar who's, thinks of this as a legitimate thing to study, and what kind of pushback you've gotten.
Well, I get asked that question a lot.
Yeah.
And I always say, what pushback? My experience of this over the last 10 or 15 years is that intellectuals in both the humanities and the sciences, by the way, are frankly in the closet. They do not deny this stuff. They just don't know how to talk about it. And they don't want to sound like the tabloids. And what I've been trying to push is that these experiences are actually about physical reality as well. You can't silo these away as metaphor or as art history or as religion. They actually have something to do with space and time and gravity and consciousness. I mean, they have to do with the actual physical cosmos. And that sort of pushes beyond all of our disciplinary boxes. But I think it's where these artists and these visionaries always were. And the other thing I say a lot is that the number one thing that trips people up is actually the imagination. They don't know how to interpret imaginal expressions of something real. They don't know how to hold it's real and it's imaginal or at the same moment. And I think that's the big challenge. And I think that's why art history is so important to this. And when I read your book, Bob, as you know, I was just thrilled. You didn't invoke the metaphor. You saw this as something that was actually happening, and you treated these artists with respect and humanity, and didn't dismiss them as, engaging in fantasy or metaphor or dreams.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Heather, do we have, maybe we have time for one question from the audience if we have any, but then if not, we'll move on to Renee.
Sure. Here's one that I think is interesting is, do you find that people have had their minds changed after visiting the archives?
So people who visit the archives have already had their minds changed. They're looking to pursue something that they already know is the case. I do think, again, I think people are generally supportive of this. The illusion that it's uncommon or that it's outsider is an illusion that is created by our social contract.
Yeah.
We agree to roll our eyes or to talk about tinfoil hats or little green people, but actually none of that is the case. And people know this stuff happens. They just won't talk about it in public. So I don't see so much people changing their minds. I see people being able to speak their minds. Let me answer the question that way.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Jeffrey. And I really appreciate your work in all of this and your support.
Thank you for letting me blab and not show art.
Oh. Okay. Well, now we're going to move on to Renee Stout. Hi, Renee. It's so good to see you.
Hi, Bob. And first, before anything, I'd like to tell Jeffrey, thank you so much. I was hanging on your every word without pictures.
Thank you, Renee. I appreciate that.
So Renee Stout, it almost seems trite to try to give some kind of a verbal introduction to who she is, because she's such a dynamic person. But she's a contemporary sculptor and assemblage artist, but she's so much more than that. We're going to see that in a moment. Born in Kansas and raised in Pittsburgh, she graduated with a BFA in painting from Carnegie Mellon University. She's a recipient of many awards. She received a 2018 Lifetime Achievement Award from the Women's Caucus for Art, and most recently the 2020 Adolf and Esther Gottlieb Foundation Award and Virginia A. Groot Foundation Award. She delivered the 2021 Floyd W. Coleman Sr. Distinguished Lecturer at Howard University's 31st Annual James A. Porter Colloquium on African American Art and Art of the African Diaspora, which I watched. It was a brilliant talk and conversation. And it was co-sponsored by the Center for the Advanced Study in the Visual Arts. She currently lives and works in Washington, D.C., and her front doorstep seems to be taken from people in the neighborhood as a crossroads. Maybe she'll talk about that in the during this, but welcome, Renee.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you for that introduction.
So Renee, you are one of the folks who, at the very beginning, when I got the green light for the show, came to mind as somebody who would be essential, because I was already familiar with your work and knew how much these various themes and ideas meant to you. And the work that's in the show is what's on the screen here. This is the Root Workers Work Table from 2011. And I thought it would be just good to start with talking about this. Could you tell us what we're looking at and what this piece means to you?
You know, it's like as a very introverted person, very shy, I've always been that way. I can talk about it now, and I've been asked to talk about work, so I've gotten used to it over time. But there was a time when it was really hard for me to talk about the work, and so what I ended up doing years ago was developing an alter ego. And for whatever reason, maybe it was because of studying the African art and being in a city like DC, where there are places where you have spiritual supply stores and, signs for readers and, fortune tellers and things like that. I created an alter ego that could get in touch with spirits. And she was a person who functioned within the community to help people through adverse circumstances, to help them spiritually, to help them, with their health if they couldn't afford to go to a doctor. She was an expert on herbs and could prescribe herbs for medical conditions. And so this protagonist and this ongoing narrative in my head just grew and grew to the point where I felt like I wanted to create sort of like the stage set, so that when people came to my shows, they could visualize this person that was sort of this playing out in my head constantly. It was as if she wasn't even me. It was like spirits coming in, and I was then channeling or becoming this vessel for these characters that I envisioned and felt were there. And it was just a strange situation. So hearing Jeff speak about that, it really starts to even help make sense for me that, I'm here with, by myself, but I have never felt alone. I've just never felt alone. And I feel like I'm part of a continuum, and that there's information that I'm supposed to impart. And through the artwork, I've been doing it. And so that's how this piece came about. I wanted the viewer, when they come to my shows, to see the evidence of this person that I've been projecting, that in some ways is who I always was and who I've given myself permission to be. But at the same time, I really feel like that I'm channeling the direction of ancestors at the same time.
Right. So can you tell us the name of that alter ego?
Fatima Mayfield, or Fatima Mayfield.
And, one in that Cosva talk, or it was in the conversation maybe with Stephen Nelson afterwards, one of the things you talked about so beautifully is how you had that sort of alter ego that you had created. And she would do things and you would imagine her doing things and being in a particular kind of state of consciousness, or providing herself as a resource for community. But then at a certain point, you said to him that you felt like you had grown into that, you had become her, or you realized that somehow those two things had merged, and you were maybe, I don't know if I put words in your mouth, you correct me, please, but it's somehow you kind of became that, or you realized that your artistic practice was already that somehow. I'm not sure if I'm getting it right, but
no, you're getting it.
Wonderful way of
getting it perfectly right. Perfectly right. Yeah.
The way you talk about that with ancestors is that it just feels like maybe she was an ancestor. Maybe she really was, and she was kind of there, and she was guiding you, and maybe in you a little bit, and then kind of saw you to a place where she was able to step back.
That's an interesting way of looking at it, because when I try to figure out, what the process was, it might be that in my younger years, I wasn't as self-aware as I am now. When you mature and you really focus on self-awareness and questioning yourself, your motives, who you're becoming, what you want. And, as I go through that process, each time, I'm getting older and older, I get, more intense about that self-examination. And I feel like it was part of me. I was projecting something that I hoped I could be, that I was too afraid to be, or that I felt the world wouldn't let me be. And then as I matured and figured out, I don't have to have anybody's permission.
Right.
I'm who I am. I'm going to evolve the way I need to evolve to be who I am and function within the world I have to navigate.
Yeah.
And that's when I realized, I'm like, well, maybe this was you all along, and then now you've grown into it. So you don't have to imagine it or project it anymore. You just are that. But then again, when you think in terms of the paranormal and ancestors guiding, it could very well be that it is in my DNA to have been chosen as a worthy vessel for a continuation of something that needs to continue.
Yeah, I love that. And I hadn't really thought about it very much, but as we're talking, there's so many artists who are included in this exhibition, who, their artistic practice, whether they're painting or drawing or whatever, and their spiritual worldview or their practices as spiritual practitioners, whatever they say that is, I think we tend to keep them in separate bins. There's art and there's this thing, but for so many artists that I've been drawn to, whether this is a coincidence or not, they don't make any distinction between those two things. And it feels like the root workers work table, which folks who approach it in the gallery think, oh, it's a bunch of stuff that Renee Stout grabbed from somewhere and assembled together, just brought together. But this is, while it feels that way, it feels like it's a thing you could see that, might be at a freaky antique shop or something like that. Almost everything here, your hand has touched and altered, and you made decisions about how to put things together. And it's all that kind of handiwork and technical skill that's contributed to it. Even that chalkboard, which isn't really a chalkboard, it's a panel that has oil stick on it looking like chalk.
Yeah.
It's all that kind of alchemy of your hand, which seems to be almost like mixing the kinds of potions. It's an analogous kind of thing, I feel like.
It really is, because, like when people see that, naturally, they're going to think it was a blackboard. But, there's that part of me that, I'm playing in my studio like a child and doing whatever it is I need to do to make what's in my imagination tangible for a viewer. But at the same time, as the artist, thinking, well, what if this piece travels? If I have a blackboard, I can't have the preparator pulling it out of the box and suddenly it gets smeared and they're like, oh my God, I've ruined the artwork. Right. So I'm like, well, if I want to look like a blackboard and I want people to not worry about handling it, then how do I make a blackboard that's not really a blackboard? So then there's the decision to say, okay, I'm going to take a panel, a wood panel, coat it with matte black latex paint that looks like a blackboard when it dries, and then take oil stick and smudge it around to look like chalk. And then it dries and you can just wipe your hand right past it and nothing happens. So I'm getting the effect that I want. But then there's that part of that playful part of me that likes to fool the viewer. So naturally they're going to come to it thinking it's a blackboard when it's a painting. It's actually, it's a painting. And then the table itself was like a 1920s, circa 1920s serving table for a dining room or whatever. And then I was at a flea market and found this old technology. I don't even know what I was going to do with it, but it was an old radio. And so I brought that home. It stays in the storage room it could be there years. And then suddenly I start working on something like this. And I'm like, that's what belongs here.
Yeah.
So you don't even know how you came to bring these things together. You just know that all these parts have been gathered and chosen. You don't know why and what they're going to turn into in the future and what parts are going to come together. That screen was my last TV, the last black and white TV before we went digital. I had a black and white TV that was in my studio, and I'd watch TV while I was working. Suddenly, when they announced we were going to digital, now I had this TV, I don't know, like maybe 15 years or something. It suddenly just stops. So I'm like, okay, well, that's going to go into the piece. But one of the things that I like that you said about having, quote, outsider artists, but more visionary artists in the show, I like that term better.
Yeah.
People have asked me, well, does this actually work? And I'm like, yeah, it does. Because what I've realized is when you're dealing with things that are spiritual, it's about intent and being open or being a transmitter, or like I keep saying, a vessel to communicate with, the spiritual world, or the universe or whatever is out there that we can't define, just being open to that energy. I feel like my intent is making it work. I don't need Pepco Electric as a middleman to make anything work, right? So when the viewer comes to it, believe that it works. I believe that it works, because that was my intent.
Yeah, and I wanted to show some other objects they're not in the exhibition, but it continues this idea of you making these like spiritual devices. And so on the left, we have device for stopping the evil eye from 2020. And is that you taking a picture?
Yeah.
And then on the right, a spirit detector from 2014. So, this is one of just bringing forward a couple of things that are in this piece and in other ways in your work, like that idea of these devices and these mysterious components that probably could tune into some other realm. You've done that on a smaller scale, but then there's also this piece, which is from 2015. And then there's like a print that you made of it, or detail called Soul Catcher Regenerator. I'm real interested in this piece. It's not in the show, but I'd love to hear a little bit about, how this relates to the root workers work table or some of the things that you were talking about. Do you imagine this functioning in a different way?
Oh, definitely. I think that I started creating these kinds of devices when I'm very empathic and I feel energies and I feel shifts in energies. And that's why at the beginning, before we actually all, we started recording and we were having a bit of a talk at the beginning. And I was saying, when is the age of Aquarius coming? I just need this energy. We're in this shift. I'm tired of it, and the turmoil. But I know that, a lot of pain sometimes happens before there's real growth. But I started feeling this well before we got to where we are now. I don't know what I was feeling. And I kept doing work about the crossroads. Like I kept saying, I feel like the country's at a crossroads. And I don't know if we're going to make the right choice at this crossroads. Are we going to go down the wrong path? And, fast forward to here and now, yes, we went down the wrong path.
Right.
And so before then, prior to the 2016 election, prior to, a whole lot of stuff that we're seeing happening now, I felt like I wanted to build a device that would shift some of the negative energy that I felt that was increasingly coming, and so calling something the spirit catcher regenerator. It's as if I could take, like somebody, let's say Fatima Mayfield. Of course, this would be one of her devices because she's the one that builds these devices. And if somebody's comes to her and they're coming with a negativity, then, she can adjust these knobs on these devices and, it catches their spirit and reorganizes the energy to make it more positive. So that's the way I envision this working. And that cage-like device has all these crystals, tied to it all over it. And I don't know what sometimes I don't know why the elements are there, but they just feel like they need to be there. You can see them better in the image that I took on the right, which is an archival pigment print photograph that I took of it.
Right.
And, I was a child of Star Trek, the first Star Trek. So of course I'm thinking, okay, you have to have the dilithium crystals.
Makes
to,
sense.
generate some energy, whatever you need to alter this energy. And so I just bring things in, like, for example, I like the idea of metaphor as well, as a writer too. I love writing, but inside of that wire cage, that is a vintage fish trap.
Okay.
So of course the trap would trap the spirit inside.
Mhm.
And you can't really see it from the photograph, but when you see the piece in person, there is a blown glass heart dangling inside of the fish cage.
Oh, yeah, I can sort of see that. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's it's about, trapping the human spirit and, rearranging the energy to, emit something more positive. So I like the idea of changing energy. And it feels to me like when I create something like this, something in me is being released, as if creating these is helping me to sort of navigate or feel like I have some power or control over the negativity that you have to navigate every day. It's like I'm countering that by producing these things.
Yeah. It's interesting. There's a mid-70s sculpture assemblage by Betty Saar in the show called Spirit Catcher. And she's talked about seeing Tibetan spirit catchers at the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago and being kind of going on her, sort of saying it and going, wow, I've been thinking of making things like this. And then she made her own kind of version of it. I haven't been able to talk to her specifically about that piece, but it has a rhyme. It really rhymes with this. Now, all the negativity, I have so many things that we could talk about, but I want to just stay on that for a moment. Because you kind of perfectly segued into just this pair of works, which I've been so amused by, but they're also deadly serious. There's this, I feel like there's a kind of capacity for the supernatural and the paranormal, which we could call natural and normal, to be a powerful political mode. And here's two works. You made others like this. I just wanted people to be able to see a different range of your work, that you are such a fine technician and such a lyrical person with, as somebody who draws and paints too. But the piece on the left is called Rearranging My Molecules to Deal with This Bullshit from 2016. And then on the right is Sun Ra and his posse putting pence in check. So, I mean, maybe we don't even need to talk about these because it's pretty clear what's going on. But, you got numbers in there on the left. Did they just kind of come to you? Do they mean something? And I just love the idea that Sun Ra is going to come and just kind of clean things up a bit.
Yeah, a lot of times when I put numbers into things, at the time when I've created something, the numbers may mean something, but then later on, after I've done the piece, like I forget sometimes because I've moved on to something else. And I don't have a habit of really recording all that I'm thinking when I create something. But definitely, this painting right here is like, I grew up with microscopes and telescopes, and that whole idea of, wanting to examine things more closely. And so it was funny because I was painting this, but just by accident, I'm painting these forms and they look like cells under a microscope, looking at some kind of cells. And that's when the title came to me. And because that's what I was feeling at the time I was painting this, all that was going on, out in the world. And then with Sun Ra, the idea of like, and I love music, music, I have a real connection to music, and Sun Ra envisioning, being in space, because, living in a world like this with so much going on, sometimes you just wish that you could just project yourself into another, universe or another planet or something like that. So I can totally understand what Sun Ra was all about and what he could imagine. And so Sun Ra gets his posse together and, he's going to deal with Mike Pence and his stuff.
Right.
So.
Exactly. Yeah. Let's see. One other thing I wanted to just talk about before we take some audience questions is this piece, which to me, you can say this about everything we're showing, that you're not really seeing it on the screen here. It just doesn't do it justice, the nuances. This is an extraordinary painting. It's oil and acrylic on panel. So there's nothing here that isn't, again, going back to that chalkboard, that trompe l'oeil chalkboard that Renee did. It's all by hand, and it's her skill at making this illusion. It's called Sketchbook with Foreboding, and it's from 2019. I wonder if you look back at this, Renee, and think about the foreboding cloud that's emanating right before 2020.
You know what? I had to do a show down at the University of Alabama at the Sarah Moody Gallery. So I was making these works. I had started this painting in 2017. And basically what it was like a trompe l'oeil version of my sketchbook. Mm-hmm. So I had all these little things and notations like this. That big black cloud of smoke was not in the middle of that. It was just a rendering of a page from a sketchbook. And at some point in time, something hit me at the end of 2019. It was November, I remember. And I got this feeling of like foreboding for no reason. I just could not understand why I was feeling what I was feeling. This painting had been wrapped up, for a couple of years after I'd done it. I went and I got it, I unwrapped it and started totally obliterating everything that was in the middle of the page with this fire and smoke. Mm-hmm. And I just felt like, I'm just seeing this smoke and this explosion and this I just didn't even know what the energy was. And then came 2020. Mm-hmm. The first time that painting was shown was in February of 2020 down there at the university. And then it was the end of February. By the middle of March, we were in COVID lockdown.
Yeah.
Then we had George Floyd and a series of other murders. I don't have to explain 2020 to anybody. We've all experienced it.
Right.
But this painting, just calling it, Sketchbook with Foreboding, once it happened, once I saw the context of, I was just like, yeah, I saw something. I felt something. Yeah. I didn't see it. Mm-hmm. I think I felt it.
Right. That's beautiful. Well, I think that there are probably folks who would like to ask you questions. So I think we should just go ahead and give them an opportunity. So if Heather, you have any people that have questions for Renee, let's see what they might be.
Well, I don't have any questions yet, so if anyone has one, throw them in the chat. But I do have some wonderful comments for Renee, including the majesty of this piece is evident. And it's interesting how objects always seem to end up with the right people. And my favorite, Miss Renee, I wish you were here in Minneapolis so we could talk to you in person. You got all kinds of magic.
Oh.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, here's the question. When you choose pieces like the objects for your first piece, do you try and learn about the history behind them, or do you just let them speak to you? When spirit imbues an object, does its power ever diminish?
I don't try to find out what the original purpose was. Like, for example, I didn't really research the radio that I found. Where you see those three knobs, that was the face of a radio. And some of these gauges at the top that look like gauges, they're not gauges at all. I hand constructed the gauges as well. But one of the reasons why I don't want to look it up first, maybe afterwards, I don't want to be bound by what the original purpose was. I just want to feel like, let me use, because it would feel to me that if I knew the original purpose, then all of a sudden these boundaries are put up in my head and the way I could use it. And so, no, I don't want to research it first.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we should also mention that all that glass on top there, much of it you made.
I did a glass residency at the Museum of Glass and Pilchuck Glass School, both in Washington State. And what they do is they have gaffers, and they like to invite artists who aren't glass artists because they want you to design glass because you don't have any preconceived ideas of what could be done. So you might come up with the most outlandish idea, and it's fun for them to be able to create what you wanted. So I would draw the pictures of what I wanted, and then they would create it. So some of this, like I would say like maybe 75% of the glass was actually glass I designed, and they produced for me, including there's a what looks like a jar with a heart on the inside that has absolutely no liquid. It's all just solid glass.
Right.
And so there are a few little things like that on top. Then they would make me glass, and I would say, well, I want this one to look like liquid is in it. So they would use this technique called encomo, where they marry two different color glasses so it looks like liquid. And then some of them actually have like resin in them, because I know you can't be transporting liquid when something goes to a museum. So I poured resins and, you know, put color in them to tint them, to make them look like actual liquid was in the piece. So there was a lot of playing around with the glass that's not just, you know, found glass sitting up there. There's a lot of manipulation of actual, you know, blown glass and altered glass and things like that.
Yeah.
Another one, do you imbue the objects? The chat just moved. Do you have a practice of imbuing the objects that you choose?
Yes, I think sometimes I am intentionally inserting certain things for like hoping for an outcome, you know, like let's say you know, I want to be lucky in something. I'm trying to achieve something and I hope the outcome is what I want. I might choose those kinds of herbs that are for prosperity or, you know, or health or whatever. So yeah, I am doing that. But at the same time, I think the very act of an artist creating does that. It, you know, it's like being an alchemist. So you're automatically in some ways doing that as you're working.
Do you want one more?
Yeah, how
Sure.
about one more?
Okay, one more. Could you comment on incorporating smells and touch, a multi-sensory experience?
Yeah, sure. It's like, you know, I'm a perfume aficionado, or perfumista, as we like to be called on our Facebook perfumista group. But yeah, I like smells, and I like the idea of, you know, sometimes putting something in a piece, and, you know, very rarely will a museum let you bother, you know, or touch things. So sometimes, you know, I have to make like one exhibition I had, I made a special tray, and the museum put up a text panel that invited the viewers to be able to pick up a jar, take the lid off and smell what I had put inside. You know, it was a whole tray of different smells so they could smell certain things, because I did want the, you know, the work to sort of work on another sensory level. You know, and, you know, you know that sometimes something will happen. Like in that one display, a woman dropped one of the jars and she was crying. And I said, I have 1 million jars at home. This is no big deal. It's easily replaced, you know. So yeah, I do like to introduce smells.
Excellent. Well, Renee, it is such an honor to have you represented by that piece in the show. And I think the world of your work and of you. So thank you for giving generously of yourself to this program and to be included in the show, and your wonderful catalog essay on the piece as well.
Thank you. And thank you so much for including me in this show, because I think it's a really important show. And it's, you know, it's something that is confirming for me, you know, in the way I think. It's not just me thinking like this, or I'm not crazy. You know? Thank you.
All right. Well, I'm going to stop sharing because we're going to go to somebody with slides. Jeffrey, you were enough. You didn't need slides, but Susan, I know, has slides. So the next speaker tonight, or this afternoon, is Susan Aberth. And Susan is the Edith C. Blum Professor of Art History and Visual Culture at Bard College, with a specialty on surrealism and Latin American art. Her book on the tarot of Leonora Carrington will be reissued this spring. It was previously sold out. And she has an essay and catalog for a show that I am really excited about, the Guggenheim Venice's exhibition, Surrealism and Magic, which opens, when does it open, Susan?
It opens in April. Soon.
Okay, wow, very soon.
Yeah.
And she specializes in art that deals with all aspects of the esoteric. She's the coordinator of the theology program at Bard, where she also teaches courses in spiritualism, Freemasonry, and alchemy. She is a kindred spirit. She's been an inspiration for my own work. And she is definitely one of the few art historians who's been all in all her career on this kind of material. So it's going to be a treat to hear from her. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you. All right, let me try this. All right, great. Well, wow, what a brilliant group of speakers. I'm very humbled to be a part of this. And I'm so thrilled by this exhibition. I've been waiting for it for, I think, I don't know, my whole life. And I was so happy to not only see the show, but to see the incredible catalog, because in that catalog are materials that have actually never been published before. So it's a real landmark. And I want to just take a few moments to think about or look at a couple of very recent exhibitions that have opened up this material. It seems like the time is finally now for a wider appreciation. I myself worked on an exhibition that I loved, Agnes Pelton, Desert Transcendentalist, which also explored spiritual topics, but it was tragically closed early. It opened at the Phoenix Art Museum. It went to the Whitney Museum, where I really wanted New Yorkers who are so closed-minded to see it. And it closed in 1 week due to the pandemic. So I was thwarted. But I suppose it really all begins in seriousness with the Guggenheim exhibition in 2018 of Hilma af Klint's work. This was really a landmark, and it drew the largest museum audience the museum had ever had, which is unbelievable. And why? Why was it that this woman, more or less unknown, would attract such a huge audience? There are a lot of reasons from a lot of different angles, but let's just focus on the art historical reasons. Well, first of all, audiences, as this proved, are hungry for women artists. They're hungry for artwork that reflects spiritual sources and aspirations. And they're also hungry for a questioning of the traditional lineage of modernism itself. And if you look at the dates of her production, you have to really start to question who, invented abstraction and what gender were they. So I'm showing you just an image of the artist who spent many, many decades actually once a week meeting with other women. They called themselves the Five, and they channeled spiritual messages. And I'm just showing you a page from her notebook, and it resembles mediumistic channeling, but it also looks like a beautiful abstract drawing. Now, the exhibition brought together these phenomenally large canvases, which the artist meant to be shown all together to construct a temple of sorts. I think it was the first time they had ever actually been put together as a temple. And in one beautiful room at the Guggenheim, which was aptly spiral shaped and imitated the natural forms in these paintings, people were just mesmerized, standing and absorbing it and feeling things that they were not used to feeling in an art museum. Now, we do know, that, of course, that she, like many of the artists I'm going to show you today, felt that the world wasn't ready to receive the messages in her work. And after her death, they were put away for quite a while. And that's why now when we can see them, they seem so fresh and contemporary. But really, there was another important exhibition 2 years earlier at the Courtauld Institute in London. And it was a remarkable, remarkable show of a medium artist by the name of Georgiana Houghton. Her notebooks were found in a spiritualist church in Australia, and they tell quite the story. So she was a practicing medium who not only did automatic writing, but she also did beautiful drawings. She was never a trained artist. And before I even show you the artwork, I think it's important to pause a moment and realized that she herself in 1871, when women weren't even really showing a lot of art, and not to mention spiritualists, she felt that her messages were so important that she financed with very meager sums an exhibition of 155 works. She framed them herself, she financed the catalog, and she sat in the gallery every single day and spoke to people in the show. So when we look at the work, and I went to the exhibition, they gave you a magnifying glass because the work is so layered and dense. It's in watercolor and gouache. It was done with both hands. She drew simultaneously with two hands. There isn't an error, a mistake, a smudge. They're so extraordinary and they're completely abstract. The exhibition had the pieces encased in glass so you could read the back, because on the back of the work were channeled messages she received about the sitter. They were usually portraits. Right? So again, we have this remarkable early work. Another important exhibition, this in 2019 at the Serpentine Gallery, also in London, was of the Swiss medium artist Emma Kuntz. She has an extraordinary healing center that's still open to the public, training mediums. And we see a photograph of her. She worked with a pendulum, and she would stand up sometimes for 24 hours at a time and do telepathic readings of people and create these completely abstract diagrams on graph paper that were a kind of a language. The color, the forms, everything about it was what she called a reading and a healing. And she stated over and over again that in the future, people would be able to understand this new language, but that right now, at that time, they were not able to do so. Well, one of the things that I study in depth is surrealism. And after the devastating losses of life after World War I and the pandemic that followed, spiritualism as a movement regained quite a bit of popularity in Europe and elsewhere, of course. And people were desperate to try to contact those who left too soon. And we're looking at the official formation of the Surrealist movement in 1924. But before we go there, I'd like to just briefly look at a series of experiments by artists who would be involved with the movement 2 years prior. We're looking at a photograph of the poet Robert Desnos. He was naturally mediumistic and could fall into trance very easily. So using spiritualist tools, he would lie on a sofa and recite poetry and words, and people would write them down, but he literally was in a trance. And he could also do drawings in trance. I only have 2 of these drawings. I'm trying to find more. I find them very interesting when compared to drawings by mediums that you see in spiritualist camps. And we're looking at one of them here. Well, he also communicated with Marcel Duchamp, and Marcel painted this wonderful painting of André Breton questioning Desnos about his alter female ego, Rose Salavie. And we see Breton holding up the famous portrait taken by Man Ray of the fictitious character who is Marcel Duchamp himself, dressed as Rose Salavie, and Desnos falling into a trance, telepathically communicating with this fictional creature. And then I thought I'd throw in this wonderful print by Marcel Duchamp of himself as a man, and then his alter ego's name written down again as if automatically written by a medium in an ectoplasmic cloud. Well, when the Surrealist manifesto was finalized, Breton was very specific about a new technique, psychic automatism, and I've given you a little definition here. This is directly taken from spiritualism, but there are several really important differences. For Breton, there would be no spiritual content, but it would instead uncover the subconscious. Interestingly enough, in one of the very earliest Surrealist journals, Breton does publish a painting done in trance by a woman called Madame Fondrion. And we see that it's very natural. It immediately reminds me, at least, of Georgiana Houghton with abstract vegetal flower-like forms in an overall pattern. So he published it. He aligns himself with trance in particular, but he also goes to great pains to distance himself from certain things that he does not like. He states the medium's age as being 79, and I think in doing so, he had a real agenda. He's saying that real spiritualism, is the domain of stuffy, charlatan old ladies. He's using it instead for a more psychological result. So also in Surrealist journals, when he does visualize psychic automatism being utilized, it is through a different kind of medium, someone young, beautiful, and female. We're looking at the left at a photograph taken by Man Ray of his wife, Simone Breton, going into trance. It's completely posed and typing automatically on her typewriter while men watch. So here's the difference. Woman is now the unconscious mediator of psychic content, and she serves to inspire the male artists, right? So she is much more passive in her communications. And so it's so interesting. Robert Desnos, who was in trance, is now instead seated at her feet and receiving. This is another photograph from a journal showing the writer posing to take messages. Now, increasingly, Surrealism will involve itself with magic and the occult. And one of the great practitioners of this would be the Romanian artist Victor Bronner. And you're seeing a work here, Elevation, which shows a mediumistic trance, I believe, a ghostly woman being levitated, while from her forehead, her third eye, a kind of golden spiral emanates. Bronner was open to this type of imagery because his father was a practicing spiritualist. And he will be a really big part of Surrealism and Magic, again, opening at the Guggenheim in Venice this April. Well, let's now look more closely at the women involved in Surrealism, and there were many of them. And unsurprisingly, they did not often go along with Breton's anti-spiritual take on psychic automatism. And one of the most important artists was Ethel Colquhoun. Not very much work has been done on her until very recently. She was really one of the last ignored women surrealists, and her interests early on were towards the esoteric. She was a member of many magical orders and was a magical practitioner. She was not simply a passive receiver. So in a drawing like this, which resembles biomorphic surrealism, maybe even some playful drawings by Miro, that's actually not what's going on here. Instead, she used trance work as a means to invoke and magically summon supernatural entities and to work with their energies for various purposes. So, and she also looked at these images as emissaries from other planes of existence, and she worked with the 4 elements. So the colors and the shapes here have esoteric content. Another woman involved with the Surrealist movement, but always very wary of coming too close because of the male-dominated nature of the movement, was the Argentine-Italian Leonora Fini, who we see here. And it's a wonderful drawing of witches. She was very transgressive in her sexuality and imagery. And this photograph reveals the performative nature of a lot of women artists involved with the movement. They were very theatrical because all occultism involves theatrics of some sort, and I mean that positively. She lived in a ruined Franciscan monastery on the island of Corsica, and she actually rigged it up so she could fly through the air like a witch. And that's what you're seeing here in this wonderful photograph of her. But a lot of her paintings subtly allude to female mystical abilities with the closed eyes. These women are in some kind of a trance doing a magical working. But it is really in Mexico that the most exciting artwork involving the esoteric happens, at least from my perspective. Mexico was the only country that allowed citizenship automatically to all World War II refugees. And therefore, many artists settled in Mexico City who were from Europe. And one of these was the Spanish artist Remedios Varo, who we see here in a beautiful photograph taken by Gatti Orna, who was another artist in exile, Hungarian. And Remedios was a friend of Victor Bronner, and her paintings, beautiful and delicate, often invoke the spirit world, other magical planes of existence. She was very involved with the Gurdjieff group in Mexico City at the time. Here are 2 more beautiful drawings that involve the spiritual world. These curtains almost look like they could be in front of a medium's cabinet, and we see faces at the top. And her work often has architecture inhabited by spirits. She was extremely close friends with another expatriate, Leonora Carrington, who was British and moved there permanently in 1943. If we're looking at, so Leonora Carrington spends her entire artistic life exploring the esoteric, and in particular, women's participation in it. Her work involves alchemy, the tarot, witchcraft, ritual magic. And in a work like The Ancestor here, you can see a magic circle. It's in an altar-like setting with this apparition, and she uses humor, right, to offset the serious content of it. This was actually done in protest against the 1968 massacre of students in Mexico City. She loved seances, and I got to know her quite well in the final years. And she had a round table at her kitchen, and she was always invoking spirits and ghosts, as we can see in The Powers of Madame Phoenicia, with the ectoplasm emanating from her. Another work by hers. And the wonderful thing about Leonora Carrington is she was not only was she an early feminist, eco-feminist, but she really believed in the taking down of all hierarchies of life forms. She thought plants and animals were equal to human beings, and a lot of her artwork shows them all interacting as equals on one plane. Back to Cati Ordna, her and Leonora did a whole series of photographs. Leonora is the model for these, Ode to Necrophilia, again about the spirit world. Bridget Tichenor, another expatriate woman involved in their circle, and she's painted the whole female surrealist circle surrounded in a cloud of ectoplasm. So much work still needs to be done on all these artists, but it's really making advances. And I would just love to briefly share with you the work of an American artist who lived most of her life in England, and that is Susan Hiller. In the early 70s, she was doing a group project that involved meditation. And to her shock, because she had no prior belief in anything, her hands started to move, and she could not stop it from moving. And she did hundreds of pages of channeled messages, a few drawings by a group of spirits that called themselves the Sisters of Menon. She didn't know what to do with this material. She framed fragments of it for display. She didn't become a spiritualist. She just acknowledged the feminist nature of women communicating from the beyond. And I'm going to end my look at another American esoteric artist who I feel is so extraordinary, and that is Marjorie Cameron. She is the most radical of all the artists I think I've shown, and was very involved with the counterculture movement in Los Angeles. Perhaps some of you know her as the wife of the rocket engineer and occultist Jack Parsons, who died tragically in an explosion in 1952. But she continued her occult work. She was a Thelemite following Aleister Crowley's work, and she is featured here on the cover of Wallace Berman's magazine Semina One. And you can see a drawing she did called Peyote Visions, where she's having sex with a demon she evoked. This was confiscated by the Los Angeles police as an obscene drawing. Now, I'll just end with a series of channeled drawings that she did. She lived in a lot of isolation, completely ignored by the art world. She had no interest in participating in any kind of commercial activity. And in the late 80s, she did a series of drawings channeling ancient Egyptian spirits and astrology. And she did these under certain conditions, and the whole series is truly extraordinary and probably not given as much attention as they should be. And I think I've kind of come to the end. I'm trying to keep within the time period and leave some room for questions.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. That was great. And I'm so glad you brought Marjorie Cameron in. I wholeheartedly agree with you that she's endlessly fascinating, and there's so much work that needs to be done on her. And
Yes.
I mean, you've already, sort of amplified the scholarship in the context of people like Remedios Barro and Leonora Carrington, which is so great. But the hope that I always have for the projects that I do, I don't know if you sort of think the same way, is that you do what you can, you seed the ground, and you hope other people are going to get excited and run with it in the next generation. So that's what we need. Students who are willing to take this stuff on and show us things that we haven't seen before.
Yes.
So Heather, do we have questions for Susan?
Nothing yet. If anyone has something, throw it in the chat real quick.
I think people are pretty tired by now.
Oh, but we got Tony and Doug is stick around for Doug Skinner, folks, because I saw him give this musical performance at Lilydale a few years ago, and it was utterly delightful. It is going to set the tone for the rest of your day in a way that will make you smile. So stick around. But maybe, Susan, one thing we could talk about is, I don't know if you found in your work and your research, this whole business about Breton trying to distance himself from spiritualism and sort of say that the voice that you're hearing is coming from within rather than outside of your body. One of the things that was fascinating to me in talking to contemporary mediums at Lilydale and Camp Chesterfield, and then looking at 19th century accounts of mediumship, again, really many of these folks are female mediums. The way they talk about that voice is not exclusive of the unconscious or the subconscious. They talk about it being necessary to put yourself into a place where spirit can come through. So this business about it being one or the other was really some kind of hang up on Breton's part, because mediums talk about it as integral somehow.
Well, I'm glad you brought it up, and I'm going to stick up for Breton, oddly enough. And that is because I think he began a certain way, and then he changed. And as time went on, especially with the horrors of World War II, he became actually a very firm believer in the necessity of magic. And he worked with the psychoanalyst Pierre Mabille, who also wrote a very important book on magic, and of course with Kurt Seligman. And as time went on, many artists in the movement, for example, Roberto Matta, they did tarot cards and were interested in astrology and in magic as well. So they changed.
So that's good. That's good to have that brought forth, because there's so many people who are younger, who come into the fold of the surrealists in that period, that already are bringing that in, as you mentioned, Mata and Seligman being completely immersed in the histories of magic. And I wondered if Breton came back to thinking differently, because he's surrounding himself then with these younger artists who are speaking the same language.
Yeah, I think so. But also he was very much influenced, I believe, again, by the war and by the encroachment of evil. The Surrealists became very interested in anti-colonialist activities. They went to the Caribbean and saw practices such as Santeria with Wilfredo Lam and also Voodoo, and they had great respect for that. And they opened themselves up to more global influences. And the wonderful exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum, Global Surrealism, really kind of broadened the field of their reach. So I think maybe that was where it was going.
Yeah.
But yes, of course, younger artists always open you up to new things.
I have one question. Are there any artists or spiritualists who relate to the events in Salem? This viewer has an ancestor who was a fortune teller there and later found guilty of witchcraft.
Well, that's a little far afield. Um, Again, there have been a number of recent exhibitions about spiritual manifestations in the American Northeast. And Salem has always been kind of an energetic hotspot due to its past, its tragic past. It's also served as a kind of a hotspot for people with esoteric interest to go to, as a kind of cleansing and revitalization of the psychic trauma that happened there. So that's as much as I know about that.
Thanks, Susan.
Well, I just want to say one more thing and then I'll stop. There is the most wonderful kitsch museum there that I really wish, I hope it's still open. It's the Museum of Witchcraft, and it's a wax museum that has all the little wax reenactments of the witch trials, and you have to stand in a red magic circle in order to view it. It's like a completely immersive, bizarre experience. Questionable, but entertaining. Okay.
So I'm going to put in the chat a link to the De Cordova Sculpture Park and Museum show, Visionary New England, which
Yes, exactly.
may have been what Susan was referring to.
Yes.
And it's, it's mostly contemporary artists who were in that exhibition, but there's some historical art, and the exhibition catalog is much broader and deals in an interdisciplinary way with why visionary sort of thought and ideas and practices rose up in New England in the 1800s, for instance.
Yes.
I looked really hard and I talked to people who are scholars of the period of the Salem witch trials. I couldn't find any drawings that had sort of been associated with that, or paintings. We had one painting that was a history painting from the 19th century about particular events that was only at the Toledo Museum. But a lot of those scholars just said this, they're writing accounts, but the visual record just didn't seem to bear out, except for sort of kitschy or over the top history paintings later. But I don't know what you found, Susan.
Well, here's the thing. The material objects associated with the craft with witchcraft have been categorically through history destroyed. And that is a really great, great tragedy. There is a wonderful witchcraft museum in Cornwall, England, maybe the only one that I know, that has a vast collection of material objects associated with the craft. And I just urgently hope that future practitioners will be very, very careful to leave their magical tools to archives such as the one at Rice. So that will be for future generations.
Yeah, the other exhibition, which I did get to see, was it's not, it's on the UK, it's on England, but it was an incredible show. Spellbound, which was at the Ashmolean, and there's a catalog for that. So if folks are interested in that kind of dimension, you can go check those things out. Thank you so much, Susan. It's such a pleasure to have you here and to hear you every time you talk. So thanks. The next speaker we have is going to be another artist featured in the exhibition, which is Tony Osler. So to keep on track here, let's go right to Tony. Trying to talk about Tony's work without being in the room with it is kind of like trying to collect water in your hands at a river. But Tony has been a pioneering figure in the new media sort of area since the 1970s, with a practice that integrates video, sculpture, painting, drawing, installation, and performance. He often explores the lasting effect technology has on humanity and the boundaries between technology, nature, and culture. He's been inspired by pop culture and its references to urban legends, fables, modern folk tales, science fiction, and the occult. and spirituality as well. His work asks us to question the veracity of information we have long taken at face value. His works take the form of a palimpsest, layering possible futures with the recent past while focusing on present-day issues. In recent years, he has used his extensive archive in conjunction with installations to blur the boundaries between art, fact, and belief systems. And Tony has a Minneapolis connection because he was at MCAD for a little while at the invitation of one of our wonderful local artists, Frank Gard. So I wish you were here, Tony, and I hope to see you here, but it's great to see you on the screen.
Thanks, Bob. And what a delight to hear all the other speakers. And I will definitely be coming out to see the exhibition. I can't miss this. And, thank you, Jeffrey, Renee, and Susan. Big fans of all of you and many of the artists in the exhibition. And Frank, of course, for years ago to come out there to Minnesota back in the 80s, where David Askevold was also there for quite a while. And that's where I also met my good friend Constance de Jong, who's on now also watching this. And she came to give a talk there, and that was the beginning of a very long friendship and collaboration and so forth. And so I have a lot of great connections to Minnesota. Also, my friend Zoran, my sea love, who's out there, one of my favorite artists. So I can't wait to get out to visit him as well.
Excellent.
So where should we start, Bob? Why
don't we just start, as my friend Walter Hamady used to say, be straightforward. It worked for Houdini. So let's start with Dust from 2006, which is what you have in the exhibition in terms of your own work, though you have generously lent from your archive. George Adamski photos and an album that's hand tinted and has tipped in Mummler photographs that some family put together, among other things. But Dust, this is just a still of this installation, which is bigger than life-sized in terms of its object, has projections and sound, light, all sorts of things. It's a phenomenological experience, really. It works on your body and the space and affects all of your senses, but it changes constantly as you're standing in there. So it was part of a larger installation riffing on thought forms, the theosophical book about visualizing intangible things. But Tony, tell us how this even came into being and what this piece has meant to you.
Well, it's funny because it did, I think when we were talking about the beginning of, what works might work in this show, and this was, I've always been interested in kind of shadow histories, I think because I'm a media artist, and, there's a kind of unsung history related to technology and, the fact that very few people know who invented the picture tube or the cathode ray tube, these kind of things. And even how the Morse code was developed by an artist and things like this, So I guess because, at certain points you can see media art, even though it's fairly popular now, it was very much on the outside, and that kind of led me into also, I guess, looking at belief systems, which has always been a fascination of mine, as you mentioned, like urban myths and things like that, and I think if you, the fact that it takes a sort of willing suspension of disbelief even to comprehend a moving image, you sort of understand how belief systems are built. I kind of grew up as a Catholic, and there's another angle into belief systems, and sort of studied conceptual art with a great cast of characters at California Institute for the Arts in the mid to late 70s. And so, belief systems I sort of brought them together around even like art movements, so this movement believed that, this movement believed that. And so I'd read Kandinsky's The Broken Line or whatever, his book, and see what his fascination was. And with conceptual art, the kind of primary idea of sort of passing an image from the artwork, from the artist to the artwork to a viewer or participant, and how that chain happens. It was an endless kind of fascination, and still is for me today, because does the idea come from me, or is it an idea that comes to me, or is a shared idea, and how that gets transmitted through the work. And so I kind of stumbled in when I was looking into my these kind of shadow histories. I began to look at that kind of occultism as a braid in between, in many aspects, starting with the camera obscura as the first moving image, which predates electricity by thousands of years, and on through the phantasmagoria and things like this. But I stumbled upon this wonderful book called Thought Forms by Ledbetter and Besant, I guess, and it kind of such an incredibly ambitious book. From what year was it from, Bob? It's is it 19?
Different editions, but 1902 or 3 is when it first came out.
And so it, arguably predates a lot of abstraction, as we're seeing in these talks. We're talking about many artists stumbled upon, kind of make leaps through these kind of mystical or otherworldly or thought experiments in different ways. And, so their idea was, to look at these sort of human auras, or the idea that this is the authors of the Thought Form book, the Theosophist, Annie Besant and Ledbetter. Their idea was to kind of codify emotions through color and sort of ambience, and it's super ambitious. Of course, there's relations to phrenology in the beginning of the understanding of the mind, the subconscious, and so forth around that time. But they also, as it turns out, looked at one of my favorite mystical artists, a guy by the name of Baraduc, who was photographing thoughts and emotions and so forth. And they kind of approached that work and carried on further with the idea that, photography, which was black and white at that time, couldn't really capture the essence of an aura. Mm-hmm. And you needed color to do that. And the only way to do it was through art. And this is kind of a long-winded explanation of how I arrived at this artwork. But so I looked at this book and I was like, this book is so incredible. The images in it are so advanced and bizarre and such a leap of faith for the time. I had never heard of it. Maybe other people have, obviously other people have, but it's sort of excluded from art history. So I thought, okay, this again is a kind of shadow history, and it's very connected in a funny way to conceptual art. So I kind of kludged on that thought and stole the title and did a series of works called Thought Forms in 2006, which were shown at Metro Pictures and around. And this particular was one of the works. There were, there was a water works called Nyx and a Mercury work and so forth. And this piece, which was called Dust. And so the idea with Dust was a kind of try to capture the formation of materiality or ideas in much in the way that thought forms or thought photography was working it, but to sort of update it, into almost like a post-nuclear apocalypse in a way, or microscopic. I like the way Renee was talking about looking at small things to understand big things, which is, as above, so below, is a very important concept in what we're talking about here, and the occult practices and so forth, alchemy. And so thinking about the idea of what is, dust, we come from dust, we come from stardust, actually. And right now the world is in a kind of transition at any given moment from chaos to creation. And the kind of this sort of material that I wanted to focus on there as a kind of intermediary between these two states was this ball of confusion called dust. And it's an early digital piece, which was kind of early days for After Effects and so forth, and to kind of craft capturing this bubble of dust or smoke in this kind of almost a virtual space, but it's actually 3D. And it's a projection, just to simply say what it is. It's 3 projections, 2 backgrounds, which meet behind the work. And there's an object, which is kind of sculpted form, which has moving images projected on it, and a poetic text around it. And
yeah, and it's startling, but there's also something that is strangely kind of mesmerizing about it. It sort of puts you to a trance. It seems, I think when people saw, still photographs of this, and I was explaining to them what it was going to be like in the museum space, they're kind of put off by it, they were confused by it. But then when you actually are engaged with it, it is almost like you've made an organism, Tony. It really has an organic quality because of the mutating, fluid, constant changing form that you kind of project onto this fiberglass amorphous thing. And it's heavy, it's a really substantial object, but then it often feels like it's not really there, or it's blending in with the environment. So when I say that a lot of your work really works in a phenomenological sense, that people feel it and sense it through their bodies, I think it's because when you're standing with these things, it does really feel like you're confronting something that's as sentient as yourself. That's the kind of the sense that you get from the technology, the way you're using technology.
That's fascinating, because you're able to see body parts, mouths, hands, feet, and so forth moving around in it. So it almost has this image of a kind of cartoon form, Philip Guston kind of form that might appear. But also, I think people are aware of the fact that there's a limited amount of materials on the planet Earth, and that we're sharing this material. So if they knock down a building over here, you're breathing the fumes over here, or somebody has an industry over there, the molecules end up in your drinking water or so forth. And in fact, you could be breathing some of the same molecules that Cleopatra was breathing. It's actually statistically possible. So there's a sense that, in this kind of above, so below sort of microcosm, macrocosm, that there is the notion of a shared space, which is what I wanted to sort of feel, that the viewer is in a position of agency and creating. So like when you say that somebody might feel put off, but then assign it with a kind of sentience, I like that, because the notion of the viewer as having agency, as being a producer, is really important to me as a participant in what's happening. So I kind of load the artwork in a different way. So the elements are there, but it's not really completed. And for some reason with dust, that's always the case, because a cloud is never completed. It's always transforming, and you participate in it. You see forms in it and see figures in it and daydream into it. And that's the beauty of creativity and the purpose of, a lot of what I try to do.
Yeah. So we have limited time, but I want to just mention to viewers here that while Tony is a maker and has made lots of different kinds of things, he's also a collector and a preserver of archives of the occult and spiritualism and all manner of esoteria. And in 2016, he was generous enough to sort of show this stuff, or a portion of his collection, at Bard, and then at MoMA. And for MoMA, you also produced a film called Imponderable that seemed to really be informed by decades of collecting and being interested in this material and learning from it, but also your own family histories. And is that you there in the center in the top, Tony?
Yeah, that's it. That's it. Yeah, I play a magician. Yeah, I play a magician and also a priest in this particular feature, 5D feature film, which was shown at MoMA and at Luma. And the story here is that, as I mentioned before, I was a kind of looking for these shadow histories, and it was part of my, whether I was working on multiple personality disorder or UFOs, back in the 80s and early 90s, I would sort of collect things. And then as time went by, I began to get more than just, a mimeograph or something, a Xerox. I would start to try to look for primary objects and photographs and so forth. And this also extended into technology and my interest in that and the formation of technology, but occult was a big part of it, and belief systems in general, cults, many different aspects coming together. But so my friend Tom Eccles, who's also up at Bard, so there's another connection over to Bard there, is also part of the Luma Foundation, where Hans Ulrich and Beatrix Roof and Maya Hoffman, who is the head and the founder of the Luma Foundation, became interested in my archive. And I hadn't really shown the archive because it was sort of hidden away, and a lot of people found it disturbing. Actually, even artist friends and so forth are like, why would you be fascinated with these con artists who are spirit photographers? And I was like, that's not the point. The point is that these are really important experiments and cultural experiments
Right.
on so many levels. And so I kind of kept the collecting, was more of a research project for me and a hobby, and I kept it hidden. And then Tom and Beatrix and the team at Luma said, well, you really should do something with that. Let's do a book. And so we produced this book, which is going into its third printing, called Imponderable. And that was really done through Luma, and then they also said, why not? Yeah, there it is, great. And they said, well, why not, make an artwork in relation to the archive? And so I decided, and I had talked about, there were a few objects that came from my family, which on my father's side in particular had a great history of. My grandfather was a magician, as well as a mystery writer, as well as a Catholic convert, as well as a debunker of psychics, and a good friend
of stuff right there. That's a lot of stuff.
Yeah, and he was became super famous for various reasons. One, the main reason, I guess, he had a few bites of the Big Apple, I guess. The first was a play called The Spider, which was on Broadway and a hit. And then later, after he converted to Catholicism, he wrote what he wanted to be as a kind of popularization of the Bible called The Greatest Story Ever Told, which was a best-selling book and a movie and so forth. And so he worked for many magazines and adored Harry Houdini, Arthur Conan Doyle, people like that. And so he worked with them on many levels and corresponded with Conan Doyle and Houdini, but did some debunking with Houdini. And so my dad and mom passed on to me a few of the artifacts from his archive. And there's a story behind a fake spirit photo which my grandfather produced to kind of hoax Arthur Conan Doyle. And so the movie is kind of generated around that, where he, as much as he loved Conan Doyle, he did, question his ability to discern fraud from truth. And he produced these kind of fake spirit photos, sent them to Conan Doyle. Conan Doyle verified them as real. And then my grandfather said, well, published it to kind of punk him, even though they were good friends. And so this is a true story, which is so fantastical that, I kind of committed it to this movie, and people can see it hopefully one time here or there.
Yeah.
I won't tell much more of the story because I'll run out of time.
It's very densely layered.
Yeah, it is. And it was shown with an archive of the material, which you showed there. So the characters you see in the movie, the interaction between Conan Doyle, Marjorie Crandon, who's one of my favorite psychics, who I consider a kind of a folk surrealist, because before we had the vote in America, we didn't have surrealism except for maybe a few artists, and women who thought outside of the box had very little avenues for expression, and some had great agency, like Marjorie Crandon, who's a kind of protagonist in my project there, and was debunked by Harry Houdini. And so there's a kind of battle of belief systems there. But Marjorie was really a folk surrealist. She did everything that a surrealist would do, which was trance writing, collage, photos, performances, actual physical performances in the form of seances. But it was all in the guise of seances, So I was trying to make this analogy that, between people who didn't have the formal aspect of art making, but were still making it, had that sheer energy of production, which Marjorie Crandon did. And you can see these incredible images in the archive and then see the story told in the film. Anyway, we can move on to other stuff.
Yeah, no. And you lent a series of photographs of Marjorie Crandon producing an ectoplasmic hand of her brother Walter they're in the exhibition. So people can see that. So just a couple things to finish on before we take questions is that, when I first saw your work as I was probably 20 or 21. It was, physical sculptures that are in spaces that are in unexpected places in galleries or museums. And then there's projections where a head might be, like on the left, which is a piece that's in the Tate. And eventually, Tony, you go to this really grand scale where you're playing with all of these different kinds of modes that, maybe weren't used or thought of as art, as you're describing Marjorie Crandon, and you get to this really public scale, like this huge projections in places that people don't expect them, maybe. Like in 2018, when you had Riverside, New York, or Park in New York, as a kind of palette to do these projections. And I wonder if you could just talk about what we're seeing here briefly, and what kind of response you got from people when they would come upon these things, if you had any anecdotal reactions.
Well, this really began also with my friend Tom Eccles years and years ago at the Public Art Fund, where he invited me to do an outdoor projection piece, as did James Lingwood at Art Angel in London, where we produced the work called The Influence Machine, which I won't really go into now, but I began projecting on trees and buildings and smoke and public spaces, and often, using these projections to get into liminal spaces that are inaccessible, only visually accessible, and these kind of populating them with various images. And this particular work was another work with the Public Art Fund called Tear of the Cloud, which I really, as I mentioned before, creative energy is something that I'm so interested in these days, and how to convert, kind of chaos into creativity, and looking at how people have done that in different ways. And this particular piece, Tear of the Cloud, is named, it's a kind of pun on the lake which feeds the Hudson River, which is, I guess, the massive river that goes right down through past Manhattan. And I grew up along the Hudson, so I've always kind of projected, in a sense, into this region, and kind of made a map, a kind of memory palace of what happened along the Hudson, whether that's the very first art movement, the Hudson River School, which started in the Adirondacks and upstate, or, Samuel Morris, who was a kind of failed painter who transposed his final picture of his daughter in a way into his invention of the Morse code. And Edgar Allan Poe's story, which is projected down into the surface of the Hudson there, which became the Murder in the Rue Morgue, but which took place in, it was a sad story of a woman who was found dead in the swamps over near Sybil's Cave in Hoboken, New Jersey. And, so there's a story about that, and kind of relating that to the birth of big data and the invention of forensics via Edgar Allan Poe. So I kind of looked at what happened along the Hudson and these creative events. And as you mentioned, the term palimpsest, sort of thinking about what, the river as a kind of metaphor for, moving back and forth. And the Native Americans really had a special view. They named it the river which moved in two directions, which is I love that idea. And it's a kind of analogous to electricity. And there's also the birth of computing, and the film industry really happened along the Hudson River. So projecting into these spaces, into this remnants of the transfer bridge there, into the trees and down into the water and around the landscape and in general there, and kind of inhabiting it with these sort of images which coax people into reinterpreting the environment in which they live, and kind of talking about some of the creative energy which happened in that area, was a very much of a dream project for me.
Excellent. So I want to be conscious of our time and make sure that we have everybody here get a chance to see Doug's performance as we finish the afternoon. But Heather, do we have any questions for Tony in the chat?
We do not. So we're all set.
Okay. Tony, thank you. It's an honor to have you in this exhibition. And I really enjoyed our conversations. And when I came to visit you, looking through your archive, it was such a pleasure. I think we only really scratched the surface. And hopefully there'll be more, just like with Renee in the future.
Well, this particular project is a real, I kind of imagined your exhibition happening at one point, because I saw the Perfect Medium show at the Met, which was kind of looking at this similar territory, but through photography. And, you know, having visited Lilydale and, you know, talking to Shannon Taggart and friends like that, and Constance, and researching, you know, it was evident that there was a shadow history in the visual arts, which you've now put your finger on. And it's just, you know, my hat's off to you and the participants, and the fact that you were able to do that and put it into such a wonderful book. So congratulations, Bob. It's major.
Thank you, Tony.
All right, my friend.
All right. Well, let's move on to Doug, who's the finale of our afternoon. Let's see. As I said, I first saw Doug perform at Lilydale in a wonderful program that was held where the mediums do their big assembly meetings. He has contributed to the Fortean Times, Cabinet, Fate, Weirdo, Nickelodeon, and other periodicals. He's a musician, a composer, and in addition to his books of stories, comics, music, and translations, including translations of Alfred Jarry, he's written many scores for dance and theater, most conspicuously for Bill Irwin's The Regard of Flight, which toured for decades, TV and movie appearances, including Ed, Crocodile Dundee 2, several of George Kuchar's videos, and a smattering of commercials. His book, Music from Elsewhere, Haunting Tunes from the Afterlife, Alien Worlds, and Occult Realms, will be available through the MIT Press in May. So without further ado, here is Doug Skinner for everybody.
Thank you, Bob. I sent you a short bio, you know, I don't know what happened to that.
Well, you deserve more, Doug.
All right, well, I have been for some years now engaged in this idiosyncratic project of trying to track down music that's attributed to non-human intelligence. And these include the intelligences such as the creatures that live on the earth, like fairies, those that are under the ground, like trolls, up in the air, like the angels, and more recently, the aliens, and the sort of ethereal beings like ghosts and spirits. And I found it useful when I do this to make it explicit that I don't think that these creatures actually exist. This may avoid angry interactions with audience members, but that I think that the music is due to some combination of dreams, hallucinations, channeling, and external sounds, often put through some sort of cultural filter that may include these beings. And of course, a lot of it is also due to lying, to hoaxing, because we have to remember that people do lie. The usual rule of thumb is that people lie only when tempted by opportunity. So that's a good rule of thumb to keep in mind. A lot of this music is European. I am searching in vain for the music of other folkloric creatures, such as the Arabian Jinn or the Algonquin Pukwudgies, the Hawaiian Menehune. I found music about them, but not music that's actually attributed to them. So I hope either I will find it eventually or somebody else can fill in the gaps. So it is this sort of psychic mess that is interesting to me. This idea that the music was not composed in the ordinary way, but that it uses perhaps some other part of the brain or uses the brain musically in a different way. So I'll give you some examples of some music that are attributed to non-human intelligences, and I'll try to keep these explanations brief. These are all complicated and messy stories, of course, but I want to spend more time on the actual music. So our first example is from Cornwall. This is supposedly the music of the Cornish fairies, who are called the Piskies. And this comes from 1921. There's a composer named Thomas Wood, who was camping in Cornwall, and he heard what he said sounded like some sort of faint music in the air. He described it as tenuous fairy strands. Fortunately, he was able to write it down. So here from 1921 is what at least Thomas Wood thought was the music of the Cornish piskies. He said that went on for about 20 minutes, fading in and out. There's a great tradition of fairy music in Ireland, of course. They have a lot of fairies in Ireland. A lot of the Irish fairy music is sort of vague in its provenance. You get a lot of stories about a tune that somebody heard from the fairies, or there's a tale about a tune that some tinker traded to a fairy for a gold ring, that sort of thing. But I'll give you a little example of some of that kind of music. This was collected in 1888 by a folklorist named Diarmaid Annally from a piper in Connacht, who said that this was a fairy dance that he had learned from the good people. Probably the spookiest member of the Irish fairy group is the Banshee. So for those of you who don't know her, she's an eerie old woman who shows up to a family, only to certain families apparently, and gives out this melancholy cry to inform them that somebody in the family is about to die, which is probably just what they need under those circumstances. But to my surprise, the wail of the Banshee has occasionally been transcribed. So I'll play a little bit of that for you. To get the full effect, you should imagine that it is coming out of the mist and the rain of a typical Irish moonlit night. This is the cry of the Banshee. This was collected in 1843 by two folklorists named Samuel Carter Hall and Anna Marie Hall. So to compare and contrast for you, here's a version of The Cry of the Banshee from 1888. This was also collected by Diarmaid Annally, who had collected the fairy dance from the piper. So as you can hear, it's similar, but not identical. It's even in the same key. I guess C minor is the key of the Banshee. And I wish I knew more about how these were collected exactly. But they're a little scant on the details of where they got these transcriptions. The fairy music of Scotland is somewhat different than the Irish in that we often have much more specific origin stories. I guess the Scots are more hard-headed people. So they often tell you exactly where their tunes came from. There's particular fairy music tradition in the Shetland Islands up in the north near Norway, where the local people are called trows or trowies. These are the local little people. And for generations, they claim, the Shetland people have claimed that they've been passing on fiddle tunes to them. There's a large repertory of trowie tunes. And as I said, the origin stories are somewhat more specific. This one is called Winja Depla. The story is that in the winter of 1803, Gibby Lawrenson of Norderhus-Gruting was pretending to be asleep when a bunch of trows came in and stole his fermented milk. And he then heard a trow named Shanko play a tune while the others danced on a nearby green. And he then pretended to wake up and whistled the tune for his son, who was a fiddler and was able to write it down. So there we not only have the time and the place and the name of the witness, but even the name of the trow. So here we go. Here is Shanko's tune, Winja Depla. Trowie tunes are still popular in the Shetland Islands, by the way. People are now posting them on YouTube, which is where I guess the Trowie tunes are now being collected. There is, of course, a lot of fairy music from other parts of the British Isles, such as the Isle of Man. Some interesting stuff from the island of Skye and from Wales. But I'd like to go up to Scandinavia, where there's the music of the Hulderfolk, the fairies, and especially of the trolls. This is a tune that appears in a lot of Norwegian folk music collections, usually under the title of underground music or troll music, and is sometimes said to be heard coming from the caverns below the ground, especially on Christmas Eve. Now, this version is from an 1861 collection edited by Peter Berggren. So here then is the Norsk Trollmusik, the music of the trolls. Well, we'll move from the underground caves up into the clouds, up into the sky, for a little taste of the music of the angels. In Christianity, at least, the tradition of angelic music goes back at least to the book of Luke, where you have the angels singing to the shepherds. But I was surprised to learn that that some of the Catholic liturgy is directly credited to the angels. Here's an example. It's from 900, the year 900, from Pope Gregory I, who was the Gregory that gave his name to Gregorian chant. And he said that he heard angels singing this little song, this little piece of plain chant. One of the interesting things about the story to me is that he said he heard the first 3 lines and then he added a 4th line of his own. So apparently even the music of the angels needed to have human intervention and papal authority. So this is Rejoice, Queen of Heaven, Regina Coeli Laetare, which is sung in the service from Easter to Pentecost. Regina Coeli Laetare, alleluia. Quia meru isti portare, alleluia. Resurrexit sicut dixit, alleluia. Here's the part that Gregory added. Ora pro nobis ad Deum, alleluia. From about the mid-20th century on, we added to this this panoply of otherworldly beings, aliens and supposed extraterrestrials. And there's been a certain amount of music that was associated with the flying saucer movement. In the 1950s, for example, a contactee named Howard Menger put out a record of piano music channeled from Saturn. And in the 70s, there's a Sicilian contactee, Eugenio Siracusa, who put out some organ music that he claimed he had channeled from an alien named Adonisis. But I want to play a little bit of Philip Rogers, who was a British musician who became interested in flying saucers in the 60s, along with many other people. But he was almost blind, so he was unable to look in the sky for lights. So he set up a tape recorder to try to capture sounds from outer space. And he did capture voices and pieces of music. Almost all of his tapes have been lost. I think there's only one that still survives. But he did notate some of it. So we have here from about 1967, some of Philip Rogers' music from outer space. Well, we'll move now to some of the music of spirits and of the supposedly from the dead. The first music actually comes, this is the only music that I know that is from a supposed time slip. And the story here is that 2 women from Oxford, Charlotte Mowbray and Eleanor Jourdain, went to Versailles in 1901, and there they entered into a peculiar state, and they saw old buildings and old people that they thought should not be there. And after they discussed it later and did some research, they came to believe that they had gone back in time to the 18th century, right before the French Revolution. And a few months after that, Eleanor Jourdain went back alone, and there she said that she had entered into another time slip, and this time she heard some music. She said there was a sound of violins far away. And fortunately, she did notate it. So we have here the only music that I know from a supposed time slip. She did say that she was unable to notate all of it. So we get the melody and some of the bass line, but she said there were a lot of parts in the middle that she wasn't able to get. And there have been, of course, many mediums who have claimed to have channeled dead composers, just as there have been mediums who have channeled literature from dead writers. Perhaps the most active one of these was a woman named Rosemary Brown, who lived in England. She was in London. And from about the 60s on, she started claiming that she was in contact with dozens of dead composers, all of the famous ones, Beethoven and Brahms and Schumann and Schubert, and that they were dictating their music to her. So she put out a record, she put out a couple of books, all of which confused her musical colleagues. General consensus was that this music seemed to sound like the composers she said that she was channeling, but not quite. There was something a little off about it. And to me, it reminds me of a lot of channeled writing that I've read, in that it makes sense, it's coherent, but in a sort of improvisational way. It's kind of improvisational and rambling. And so fittingly, the composers she felt the most affinity for were those like Liszt, who had a somewhat improvisational style. But here's a piece, so you can hear for yourself, from 1980 that she said she channeled from Edvard Grieg, a children's piece called A Song of Childhood. In the 19th century, the idea of contacting the dead became particularly popular with the rise of the spiritualism movement. Now, some of you may know this, some of you may not, so I may as well give the details here. That really began in 1848 with two sisters up in Hydesville, New York, Margaret and Catherine Fox, who claimed to be able to communicate with the dead by means of knocking and rapping, like the recently invented telegraph. And they hooked up with their older sister, Leah, who was in fact, didn't claim to be medium, but acted as their agent and helped them find a lot of bookings. They did some public appearances and public seances. And they did, in fact, come up with a piece of music that they said had come from table rapping. The story was that in 1851, Leah Fox and Catherine were at home, sitting at home, when the knocking came through and gave them a series of letters, which didn't make any sense to them. But the spirit told them to play these notes on the piano, these letters on the piano, and then to apply them to a poem by Felicia Hemans, who's a popular poet at the time. And that's how we got The Haunted Ground by the Fox sisters. Now, there are many reasons for not believing this story, particularly since the Fox sisters did later confess to fraud and then deconfessed. It became very complicated. But at any rate, on the sheet music, it says that this music was performed by the Fox family. So I assume that this meant that this was the song that they performed at their public appearances. Here's The Haunted Ground, then, from 1851. There are 10 verses here. I'm only going to sing a couple. The couple that I guess Leah Fox liked the best, because those are the ones she put in her autobiography. Yes, it is haunted, this quiet scene, fair as it looks and all softly green. Yet fear thou not, for the spell is thrown, and the might of the shadows on me alone. Have I not under these whispering leaves woven such dreams as the young heart weaves, shadows yet unto which life seemed bound? And is it not haunted ground? So that, I think, is a suitably ambiguous and dubious piece to end this on. So thank you very much, Bob.
Thank you, Doug.
And I don't know if there are any questions or
In virtual
complaints.
space, you can't hear the clapping, sadly.
No, there's nothing there. There's this computer screen.
I know, so disconcerting. Okay, well, one of the things that somebody asked that I'm also curious about is somebody named Gail Jentz asked, all of these pieces are quite tuneful, even the Banshee. Are there any pieces you've heard that are cacophonous or completely lacking in time signature?
No, not so much. There's some that are sort of rambling and less metered, like the piano music of Howard Mencher, for example, is kind of just it sort of sounds like noodling in the key of B flat. The Philip Rogers music is not what we would call conventionally melodic, I suppose.
Sure.
But most of this does come through the local cultural tradition, which is often very tuneful. So if people hear the music of the fairies, then it will be music from their own culture.
Yeah, they seem like dances.
Yes, well, that's what the fairies do.
Well, yes, among other things, but yes, they dance a lot.
Yes.
Yeah, there was one of the, I don't know if you played one of those tunes tonight, but one of the things you talked about in terms of the circumstances behind collecting these things is, the story of somebody coming home late from a pub.
Yes.
And hearing something, and just for, a few seconds, seeing what was going on in a clearing and remembering that tune and going home and scribbling it down.
Right.
There's something really lovely about that, but I think that's also just sort of gets. I think at Lilydale you played pieces where you're like, there's only maybe 10 seconds of the tune because of that.
There's some very brief ones like that.
Mm-hmm.
There's one from I think this is from Wales, where somebody was near a waterfall and he heard like three or four musical notes, and he wrote them down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so is there much more is there much more UFO music or music that's coming out from transmissions from somewhere else that came up in the 1950s or 60s in your book?
Yeah, there's some Bernard Bryson, for example, who channeled the music in the language of space, which is called Solix Mal. I don't know if you're familiar with Solix Mal. George Hunt Williamson also was interested in this language of space. But Bernard Bryson did some songs that were in this language. So I'm certainly putting one of those in the book. I didn't do it here because it's quite long.
Yeah. Well, Doug, thank you so much. It's been a long afternoon for everybody, I think, because, you know, Zoom is what it is. But I feel that everybody's, you know, contributions and passion about all of this material really came through despite this technology. And I'm really grateful for you to have participated in this way. And for all of the folks out there who stayed with us and are listening, thank you so much for being here to hear these talks and performances. I hope you'll get a chance to see the exhibition at the Minneapolis Institute of Art, which goes till May 15th. We do have other programming that we're planning to do, including Molly McGarry, a scholar who's written on spiritualism, who will be at MIA on the anniversary of the birth of spiritualism on March 31st to give a talk about it. And then we have a panel with Indigenous artists who are included in the exhibition, Choling Taha, John Hoteleanos, and Chris Papin. And that'll be moderated by Andrea Carlson. That's in April. And then Allison Sarr will be giving a talk on May 12th. So much more partnerships with the Twin Cities Film Festival folks and Moon Palace Books. Look on our website for that. But until all of those things happen, thank you to Renee and Susan and to Tony and Jeffrey and to you, Doug, and to Angela and Heather and everybody, including Molly, who made this possible. So have a great day, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.